On the evening of March 7th, 1982, a 19-year-old college student named Michael Brennan discovered a metal box hidden beneath the floorboards of his childhood bedroom in Falls Church, Virginia, that would destroy everything he believed about his family. Michael, a sophomore majoring in political science at Georgetown University, had come home that weekend to help his parents prepare the house for sale. His father, David Brennan, 51, had recently announced plans to retire early from his position as a senior analyst at the Defense Intelligence Agency, and the family intended to relocate to a smaller property in North Carolina. Michael's mother, Catherine, 49, a part-time librarian at the Fairfax County Public Library System, had asked him to sort through his old belongings and decide what should be kept, donated, or discarded. The house at 847 Oakmont Drive was a modest split-level ranch built in 1963, situated on a quiet residential street lined with similar middle-class homes. The Brennans had purchased it in 1969, when Michael was 6 years old and his younger sister Jennifer was 3. It was the only home Michael could clearly remember living in. His childhood bedroom, located on the second floor overlooking the backyard, measured approximately 12 feet by 14 feet. The walls were still painted the pale blue his mother had chosen when he was in elementary school. A twin bed sat against the eastern wall, a wooden desk beneath the window, and a bookshelf filled with textbooks, paperbacks, and model airplanes occupied the space near the closet. Michael had been removing books from the shelves, sorting them into cardboard boxes, when he noticed that one section of the hardwood floor near the closet produced a hollow sound when he stepped on it. The floorboard, approximately 8 inches wide and 3 feet long, appeared slightly raised compared to the surrounding planks. He knelt down and examined it more closely. The nails securing it looked different from the others in the room, newer, shinier, with less rust around the heads. When he applied pressure to one end of the board, the opposite end lifted slightly, revealing that it had been cut and placed back rather than properly secured. Using a flathead screwdriver from his father's toolbox, Michael pried up the board. In the cavity beneath, approximately 6 inches deep, sat a gray metal lockbox measuring roughly 10 inches by 7 inches by 4 inches. The box was cool to the touch and surprisingly heavy. It had no visible lock, just a simple latch mechanism. Michael lifted it out and set it on the floor beside him. His first thought was that it might contain family documents, or perhaps cash his parents had hidden away. He had heard stories of people from his grandparents' generation who distrusted banks and kept emergency money in their homes. He opened the latch. Inside, wrapped in a plastic bag, were items that made no immediate sense to him. A Minox B camera, roughly 4 inches, long and known for its use in espionage photography, 3 rolls of undeveloped film, a one-time pad cipher book with pages of seemingly random 5-digit number groups, approximately $7,000 in cash bound in neat stacks with rubber bands, and a small notebook containing columns of numbers, dates, and abbreviated notes in his father's distinctive handwriting. The dates in the notebook ranged from April 1974 to February 1982, just 1 month earlier. Some entries were accompanied by single letters, P, M, L, K. Others had location notations, Rock Creek, Potomac, Arlington Cemetery. Michael sat on the floor of his bedroom, the contents of the box spread around him, trying to construct an explanation that made sense within the framework of what he knew about his father. David Brennan had worked for the Defense Intelligence Agency for 23 years. He had served in the U.S. Army during the Korean War, achieving the rank of sergeant before his discharge in 1955. He held a top-secret security clearance. He coached Michael's Little League team from 1972 to 1975. He attended parent-teacher conferences, mowed the lawn on Saturday afternoons, and read the Washington Post every morning while drinking coffee from the same blue ceramic mug he had used for as long as Michael could remember. He was, by every measure Michael possessed, an ordinary suburban father who worked a government job and came home for dinner every evening at 6:30. But the Minox camera was not ordinary. Michael had studied enough about intelligence operations in his political science courses to recognize it. The Minox B was a precision German camera that produced negatives measuring 8 by 11 millimeters, ideal for photographing documents. It was standard equipment for intelligence officers and their assets. The one-time pad was even more specific, an encryption method that provided theoretically unbreakable security if used correctly. Each page contained random number sequences used to encode and decode messages. Once a page was used, it was destroyed, making the code impossible to break without access to an identical pad. Michael's hands shook as he picked up the notebook again. He turned to a recent entry dated February 18, 1982. M. Rock Creek, North Path, 1400 hours. Package delivered. 4K received. Next contact April 15th. The notation was cryptic but unmistakable in its implication. His father was meeting someone, delivering something referred to as a package, and receiving money in exchange. The location, Rock Creek Park, was a sprawling forested area that stretched through northwest Washington, D.C., a place well known among intelligence professionals as suitable for clandestine meetings due to its numerous trails, limited surveillance, and legitimate reasons for people to be present. The afternoon light coming through the bedroom window had shifted toward late-day gold, indicating it was approaching 5 o'clock. Michael could hear his mother moving around in the kitchen downstairs, preparing dinner. His father had mentioned he would be home by 6. Jennifer was away at college in Pennsylvania, completing her junior year at Bryn Mawr. Michael was alone in the house with evidence that suggested his father was involved in something illegal, something that betrayed the very agency he worked for and the country he had served in uniform. Michael's initial instinct was to believe there must be an explanation, that perhaps his father was working undercover, conducting some sanctioned operation that required this equipment and these clandestine meetings. But the cash troubled him. Government operations did not typically involve an analyst bringing home thousands of dollars in unmarked bills and hiding them beneath his son's bedroom floor. The dates troubled him, too. The notebook showed regular activity spanning nearly 8 years, far too long for a temporary undercover assignment. And the concealment itself troubled him most of all. If this were legitimate, why hide it in such an unusual location? Why not keep it in a home safe or locked filing cabinet? Michael returned the items to the box, closed the latch, and replaced the box in the cavity beneath the floorboards. He fitted the board back into place, pressing down until it sat flush with the surrounding floor. He left the room exactly as he had found it, with the books half sorted and the cardboard boxes partially filled. He went downstairs, told his mother he was not feeling well, which was true in a way he could not explain, and said he needed to drive back to his dorm at Georgetown to rest. Catherine Brennan, a woman with graying brown hair and the patient demeanor of someone who had spent 2 decades working with children in libraries, felt his forehead, determined he had no fever, and packed him a container of leftover chicken soup to take with him. Michael drove the 11 miles from Falls Church to Georgetown in a state of profound disorientation. He had left the house at approximately 5:20 in the afternoon, before his father arrived home. The traffic on I-66 was heavy with Sunday evening commuters returning from weekend trips. Michael navigated it automatically, his conscious mind occupied with the impossible task of reconciling the father he knew with the evidence he had discovered. By the time he reached his dorm room, a small single on the 3rd floor of Harbin Hall, it was nearly 6:30. He lay on his bed and stared at the ceiling until well past midnight, unable to sleep, unable to think clearly, unable to decide what he should do. David Brennan had been recruited by Soviet intelligence in the spring of 1974, though the process of recruitment had begun nearly 2 years earlier. The approach had been gradual, sophisticated, and carefully calibrated to exploit both his circumstances and his psychology. In 1972, David had been passed over for a promotion he believed he deserved, a senior analyst, position that went instead to a colleague with better political connections within the agency, but, in David's view, inferior analytical skills. The disappointment was compounded by financial pressures. Michael was 9 years old and Jennifer was 6. Catherine worked only part-time, so she could be home when the children returned from school. The family's single income barely covered their mortgage, car payments, and the rising cost of groceries and utilities as inflation accelerated. David's resentment festered quietly. He continued to perform his duties at the Defense Intelligence Agency with apparent dedication, analyzing intelligence reports related to Soviet military capabilities. His work required him to review classified documents detailing Warsaw Pact force deployments, weapons systems, and strategic planning. He held a top-secret clearance with compartmented access to particularly sensitive information. He was, from the perspective of Soviet intelligence, an ideal potential asset. Access to valuable intelligence, motivation stemming from professional disappointment and financial stress, and a personality profile that suggested he might be susceptible to recruitment if approached correctly. The initial contact occurred in September 1972 at a professional conference in Chicago on military technology assessment. David was attending as part of a Defense Intelligence Agency delegation. During a reception at the conference hotel, a man who introduced himself as Martin Kovac, a professor of international relations at Northwestern University, struck up a conversation with David about Soviet military doctrine. Kovac was knowledgeable, engaging, and shared David's assessment that American intelligence often underestimated Soviet conventional forces while overestimating their technological sophistication. They met for drinks twice more during the conference. Kovac asked thoughtful questions about David's work, expressed interest in his analytical methods, and lamented the difficulty of obtaining reliable information about Soviet military capabilities for his academic research. He suggested they stay in touch. Over the following year, they exchanged letters, always sent to David's office, always framed as professional correspondence between an analyst and an academic. Kovac occasionally asked David's opinion on specific questions related to Soviet force structure, requests that seemed reasonable for an academic researcher, but that gradually required David to reference classified materials to formulate his responses. In November 1973, Kovac visited Washington and invited David to lunch. Over drinks afterward, Kovac explained that he occasionally did consulting work for private research firms and asked whether David might be interested in providing analytical assessments for additional income. The pay would be modest, Kovac said, perhaps $200 per report, but it would be legitimate consulting work and could help supplement his government salary. David, whose financial situation had not improved and who still felt bitter about the promotion he had been denied, agreed. The first few reports David prepared were innocuous, general assessments of Soviet military trends that could have been compiled from open-source information. But gradually, Kovac's requests became more specific. By early 1974, David was providing detailed information that clearly came from classified sources. When David expressed concern about this, Kovac assured him that the information was being used only for academic research and strategic forecasting by private firms, not for any hostile purpose. He increased the payments to $500 per report. In April 1974, during a meeting in Rock Creek Park, Kovacs had suggested they meet there rather than in restaurants to ensure privacy. Kovacs revealed his true identity. He was not actually an academic. His real name was Yuri Petrov, and he was an officer with the first Chief Directorate of the KGB, responsible for foreign intelligence operations. David's initial reaction, according to his later testimony, was panic. He understood immediately that he had been deliberately compromised. But Petrov was calm and reassuring. He explained that David had broken no laws yet. The consulting arrangement could still be portrayed as legitimate. However, if David refused to continue, Petrov would be forced to inform David's superiors at the Defense Intelligence Agency about their relationship, which would at minimum cost David his security clearance and likely his career. Moreover, Petrov had evidence, copies of the classified reports David had prepared, that could be used to prosecute him. Petrov offered an alternative. Continue providing intelligence, but with the understanding that he was now working directly for Soviet intelligence. The compensation would be more substantial. David would receive $4,000 per successful dead drop, conducted approximately every 6 weeks. Over the course of a year, this would amount to more than $30,000, nearly doubling his government salary. David Brennan agreed. His later statements to FBI investigators and in court testimony offered various justifications for this decision: fear of prosecution, financial desperation, belief that the information he was providing was not truly damaging to American security. But the fundamental fact remained that from April 1974 onward, David Brennan was a Soviet intelligence asset operating within the Defense Intelligence Agency. The tradecraft was straightforward but effective. David would photograph classified documents using the Minox camera Petrov provided. He conducted this photography in his office, working late on evenings when few colleagues were present. The documents were returned to their secure storage locations before morning. The film rolls were delivered via dead drops in Rock Creek Park, Potomac, and occasionally at Arlington National Cemetery, locations that offered both privacy and plausible deniability for David's presence. The payments, in cash, were retrieved from the same or nearby locations during subsequent visits. David used a one-time pad to confirm meeting times and report any changes in his access or security procedures. He never met Petrov in person after that initial revelation in April 1974. All subsequent contact was mediated through the dead drop system and encrypted messages. For 8 years, David Brennan maintained his dual existence. To his family, his colleagues, his neighbors, he was a mid-level government analyst living an unremarkable suburban life. To Soviet intelligence, he was a valuable asset providing regular intelligence on American assessments of Soviet military capabilities. The money he received allowed the family to live more comfortably than they otherwise could have. They took a vacation to Florida in 1976. They purchased a second car in 1977. They renovated the kitchen in 1979. Catherine Brennan noticed the improved finances but accepted her husband's explanation that he had received raises and bonuses for exceptional performance. The children noticed nothing at all. Why would they? Their father came home for dinner, helped with homework, attended school functions, and seemed no different than any other middle-class suburban father. The metal box containing the Minox camera, unused film, the one-time pad, and accumulated cash represented the tangible evidence of David's activities, evidence he should have destroyed or hidden in a more secure location, but had kept, perhaps out of some subconscious desire to be discovered, or perhaps simply because he had nowhere else to put it that seemed safer than beneath his own son's bedroom floor. Michael Brennan spent the week following his discovery in a state of paralyzed indecision. He attended his classes at Georgetown, American Foreign Policy on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, comparative political systems on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday afternoons, but absorbed almost nothing of the lectures. He sat in the library ostensibly studying for an upcoming midterm examination, but found himself unable to focus on the textbook pages in front of him. His mind circled endlessly around the same questions. What exactly had his father done? How long had it been going on? What were his obligations as a son, as an American citizen, as someone who had taken an oath when he registered for the Selective Service at age 18 to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic? He considered confronting his father directly, but rejected this option repeatedly. If his father was indeed involved in espionage, confronting him would simply give him warning to destroy evidence and perhaps flee. Michael had read enough about intelligence operations to know that Soviet assets who were compromised sometimes defected to the Soviet Union rather than face arrest and imprisonment. The thought of his father disappearing to Moscow, of never seeing him again, of having to explain to his mother and sister what had happened, was unbearable. He considered telling his mother, but rejected this as well. Catherine Brennan was, as far as Michael could determine, completely innocent. She had no background in intelligence work, no apparent political ideology that would make her sympathetic to Soviet communism, no suspicious activities of her own. Burdening her with knowledge of her husband's betrayal before Michael himself understood the full scope of what was happening seemed cruel and potentially dangerous. If she confronted David, it could trigger the same flight risk that worried Michael about confronting his father directly. He considered doing nothing, simply replacing the board and pretending he had never made the discovery. This option was appealing in its simplicity. If his father was planning to retire and move to North Carolina, perhaps his espionage activities would cease. Perhaps the problem would resolve itself. But this felt like cowardice, and it ignored the fundamental question of how many American intelligence operations had been compromised, how many intelligence officers had potentially been exposed, how much damage had been done to national security. Michael believed in the Cold War framework that had shaped his entire life. He had grown up during the 1960s and 1970s watching the Soviet Union expand its influence, support communist insurgencies, and threaten American interests globally. The notion that his father might have been aiding that expansion created a moral imperative that Michael could not ignore indefinitely. By Friday, March 12th, Michael had made a decision. He would report what he had found to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, which had responsibility for counterintelligence operations within the United States. He would do this anonymously, if possible, providing enough information for the FBI to initiate their own investigation while protecting himself from the immediate emotional consequences of betraying his father. It was a compromise that satisfied neither his loyalty to his family nor his sense of civic duty, but it was the only path forward that Michael could tolerate. On Saturday morning, March 13th, Michael drove to a payphone outside a 7-Eleven convenience store in Alexandria, Virginia, several miles from both his parents' home and his Georgetown dorm. He had looked up the FBI's Washington field office number in the phone book and written it on a small piece of paper. At approximately 10:15 in the morning, he dialed the number. A receptionist answered. Michael asked to speak with someone in counterintelligence. After a brief hold, he was connected to a duty officer who identified himself as Special Agent William Hartman. Michael, his voice shaking despite his efforts to remain calm, said, "I have information about a possible Soviet intelligence asset working at the Defense Intelligence Agency." Hartman's tone immediately became more focused. He asked Michael's name. Michael said he preferred to remain anonymous. Hartman explained that anonymous tips were difficult to investigate without additional details. Michael, after a long pause, provided his father's name, position, and address. He described the contents of the metal box hidden beneath the floorboards. He mentioned the dates in the notebook and the references to Rock Creek Park. Then, before Hartman could ask additional questions, Michael hung up. He sat in his car in the parking lot of the 7-Eleven for nearly 20 minutes, breathing slowly, trying to suppress the nausea that had risen in his throat. He had just set in motion events that would destroy his family. He knew this with absolute certainty. Whatever came next, investigation, arrest, trial, imprisonment, would tear apart the life his mother and sister believed they were living. Jennifer was 20 years old, a junior at Bryn Mawr, planning to apply to graduate school in art history. Catherine was 49 years old, looking forward to retirement and relocation to North Carolina. Neither of them had done anything wrong. Neither of them deserved what was about to happen. And yet Michael could not think of any alternative action that would have been morally defensible. He drove back to Georgetown and spent the rest of the weekend in his dorm room, waiting for something to happen, though he had no idea what form that something might take. Special Agent William Hartman had been working counterintelligence cases for the FBI's Washington field office for 11 years. He was 42 years old, married with 3 children, and had developed a reputation as a methodical investigator who built cases carefully and thoroughly. The phone call from Michael Brennan, though Hartman did not yet know the caller's identity, was unusual primarily in that the tipster had specific, detailed information rather than vague suspicions. Most anonymous reports of espionage were based on nothing more than someone's dislike of a coworker or neighbor who seemed too friendly with foreigners or asked suspicious questions. This call was different. The tipster knew about a Minox camera, a one-time pad, dead drop locations, and dates of meetings. This was specific enough to warrant immediate investigation. Hartman initiated a preliminary inquiry. Records checks confirmed that David Allen Brennan, age 51, was indeed a senior analyst at the Defense Intelligence Agency, employed since 1959. He held a top-secret clearance with access to compartmented information. His personnel file showed no previous security concerns, no foreign contacts outside normal professional channels, no financial problems flagged during his most recent background investigation in 1979. He lived at 847 Oakmont Drive in Falls Church with his wife Catherine and had 2 children, Michael, 19, and Jennifer, 20. His performance evaluations were consistently satisfactory, though not exceptional. He had been passed over for a promotion to GS-14 in 1972, but had received several step increases and annual bonuses since then. On Monday, March 15th, Hartman briefed his supervisor and requested authorization to conduct physical surveillance and possibly obtain a Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act warrant to search David Brennan's home and office. The supervisor, a cautious man named Robert Delaney, who had been burned by insufficient evidence in previous cases, told Hartman to conduct the surveillance first. If the surveillance corroborated the tipster's information, then they would pursue the FISA warrant. The surveillance operation began on Tuesday, March 16th. A team of 4 agents, rotating to avoid detection, established observation points near David Brennan's home and followed him during his daily routines. For the first week, nothing unusual occurred. David drove from his home in Falls Church to the Defense Intelligence Agency headquarters at Bolling Air Force Base, arriving between 7:45 and 8:15 each morning. He worked in his office until sometime between 5:30 and 6 in the evening. He stopped occasionally at a grocery store or gas station on his way home. He had dinner with his wife. He watched television. On Saturday, March 20th, he mowed his lawn. On Sunday, March 21st, he and Catherine attended church services at St. James Catholic Church in Falls Church, as they had done nearly every Sunday for 13 years. The surveillance might have been abandoned as unproductive, except for an entry in the notebook Michael had mentioned. One notation, which Michael had read to Hartman during the phone call, indicated, "Next contact, April 15th. It was now late March. Hartman decided to continue the surveillance through mid-April to see if David Brennan would indeed make contact with his handler on or around the 15th. David Brennan's behavior changed subtly during the first week of April. He began taking longer routes home from work, routes that were less direct and suggested possible surveillance detection measures. On April 7th, he stopped at a hardware store and purchased several items, including trash bags, batteries, and a flashlight, items that could be innocent purchases or could be materials for preparing a dead drop. On April 12th, he left work early, claiming illness according to logs the FBI later obtained, and drove to Rock Creek Park. He parked in a lot near the nature center and walked north along one of the main trails. The surveillance team, maintaining a discreet distance, observed him walking for approximately 40 minutes. He examined various trees and large rocks along the path, apparently looking for something. He did not appear to make contact with anyone or leave anything behind. After approximately an hour, he returned to his car and drove home. On Thursday, April 15, 1982, the date specified in the notebook, David Brennan again left work in the early afternoon. The surveillance team followed him as he drove into Rock Creek Park and parked in the same lot he had used 3 days earlier. This time he carried a small backpack. It was approximately 2:30 in the afternoon. The weather was clear and cool, with temperatures in the mid-50s. The park was moderately populated with joggers, dog walkers, and tourists enjoying the spring weather. David walked north on the main trail, then branched onto a smaller side path that led deeper into the wooded area. The surveillance team, now acutely aware that this might be an operational meeting, positioned themselves at various points to maintain visual contact while remaining concealed. David walked to a large oak tree approximately 30 yards off the main trail. He stopped, looked around carefully, which caused the surveillance team to freeze in their positions, and then knelt beside the base of the tree. He appeared to be examining something at ground level, though the surveillance team could not see clearly what he was doing from their positions. After approximately 2 minutes, David stood up and walked back toward the main trail, no longer carrying his backpack. The surveillance team allowed him to leave the area and drive away. Once his car was out of sight, 2 agents approached the oak tree. At its base, partially concealed by leaves and forest debris, was a hollow space between 2 of the tree's exposed roots. Inside this natural cavity, wrapped in a plastic bag, was David's backpack. The agents did not disturb it. Instead, they retreated and maintained observation of the location. Approximately 90 minutes later, at 4:25 in the afternoon, a man in his mid-30s approached the oak tree. He was white, approximately 5 feet 10 inches tall, with dark hair and wearing a brown jacket and jeans. He walked directly to the tree, knelt at the base, retrieved the backpack from the cavity, and placed a different package, a manila envelope, in the same location. He then walked back toward the main trail and exited the park. The surveillance team followed him to a parking lot where he got into a car with diplomatic license plates registered to the Soviet embassy. The FBI now had visual confirmation of a dead drop operation conducted by David Brennan with a Soviet intelligence officer. On Friday, April 16th, agents obtained a FISA warrant and conducted simultaneous searches of David's office at the Defense Intelligence Agency and his home in Falls Church. Catherine Brennan was at work at the library when agents arrived at the house. They presented the warrant, conducted the search, and located the metal box beneath the floorboards in Michael's bedroom exactly where the tipster had indicated it would be. The box contained the Minox camera, 3 unexposed rolls of film, the one-time pad, approximately $6,800 in cash, and the notebook detailing 8 years of intelligence operations. David Brennan was arrested at his office at approximately 9:30 on the morning of April 16, 1982. He was 51 years old. He had been passing classified intelligence to Soviet handlers for 8 years. The damage assessment would eventually conclude that he had compromised dozens of classified documents, including assessments of Soviet military capabilities, American intelligence collection priorities, and information about other intelligence operations. Several American intelligence sources in Eastern Europe had been exposed and recalled or arrested based on information David had provided. The full extent of the damage could never be precisely calculated, but it was substantial enough to be considered one of the most serious breaches of the Defense Intelligence Agency's security in its 20-year history. Michael Brennan learned of his father's arrest from a phone call from his mother on the evening of April 16th. Catherine's voice was nearly unrecognizable, high-pitched, breaking, oscillating between hysteria and shock. "Michael, something terrible has happened," she said. "The FBI came to the house. They searched everything. They arrested your father. They said he was a spy. They said he's been working for the Russians. Michael, they must have made a mistake. Your father would never do something like that. There has to be an explanation." Michael, sitting in his dorm room with the phone pressed to his ear, felt a sensation similar to drowning. He had initiated the investigation. He had made the anonymous phone call that led to the surveillance that led to the arrest. His mother did not know this. Jennifer, when she called him 20 minutes later, crying and incoherent, did not know this. No one knew except Michael himself and the FBI agent he had spoken to. Michael told his mother he would drive home immediately. He told Jennifer the same thing when she called. He hung up the phone and sat motionless for several minutes, trying to comprehend what he had done. He arrived at the house in Falls Church shortly after 8 in the evening. His mother's car was in the driveway, along with Jennifer's. She had driven down from Bryn Mawr as soon as she heard the news. Inside, Catherine and Jennifer sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by the remains of coffee cups and tissues. Catherine looked 10 years older than she had the previous weekend. Jennifer's eyes were red and swollen. They embraced Michael when he entered, seeking comfort he did not know how to provide. "They're saying your father betrayed his country," Catherine said. "They're saying he gave classified information to Soviet intelligence. Michael, you know your father. You know he would never do that. He served in Korea. He's worked for the government his entire adult life. There has to be some mistake, some misunderstanding." Michael sat down at the table. He felt the weight of what he knew pressing down on him like a physical force. He could tell them the truth, that he had found the evidence, that he had made the phone call, that their father was indeed guilty. Or he could remain silent and allow them to believe in their father's innocence for as long as possible. He chose silence. "I don't know what happened," he said, "but we'll figure it out. We'll get him a lawyer. We'll hear his side of the story." David Brennan's first court appearance was on Monday, April 19th. He was represented by a public defender named Thomas Carlson, a young attorney with limited experience in espionage cases. David entered a plea of not guilty. The prosecution presented evidence of the dead drop operation, the materials found in his home, and preliminary findings from their damage assessment. The judge, a federal magistrate named Patricia Donovan, denied bail based on the flight risk posed by someone accused of espionage who clearly had connections to Soviet intelligence. David was remanded to federal custody pending trial. Michael, Catherine, and Jennifer attended the hearing. It was the first time they had seen David since his arrest. He looked diminished in the orange jumpsuit issued to federal detainees, his hands cuffed in front of him. He made eye contact with his family briefly, but said nothing to them. The entire proceeding lasted less than 20 minutes. In the weeks following the arraignment, the Brennan family began the slow process of disintegration. Catherine took a leave of absence from her job at the library. She could not concentrate on work, and the media attention surrounding the case had made her workplace uncomfortable. Reporters had called the library asking for comments about her husband. Colleagues had expressed sympathy that felt more like pity. Jennifer returned to Bryn Mawr but struggled to focus on her studies. Her professors were understanding, but she had missed 3 weeks of classes and was falling behind in her coursework. Michael returned to Georgetown but found it equally difficult to continue with normal academic life. He was haunted by guilt and uncertainty. Had he done the right thing by reporting his father? Should he have confronted him first? Should he have given him the opportunity to turn himself in? The questions were endless and unanswerable. He found himself avoiding conversations with friends who asked about his father's arrest. He stopped attending social gatherings. He spent most evenings alone in his dorm room, reading about espionage cases and trying to understand the psychology of people who betrayed their countries. David Brennan's attorney, Thomas Carlson, met with the family several times during May and June of 1982. He explained that the evidence against David was substantial and that a trial would likely result in conviction. He recommended that David consider a plea agreement. The prosecution, Carlson explained, was willing to offer a reduced sentence in exchange for a full confession and cooperation with their damage assessment. Specifically, they would recommend a sentence of 18 years in federal prison rather than the potential life sentence David faced if convicted at trial. Catherine insisted that David was innocent and should fight the charges. Jennifer agreed. Michael remained silent during these family discussions. He knew the truth, but could not bring himself to advocate for a plea agreement without revealing how he knew the evidence was legitimate. On June 14, 1982, David Brennan met privately with his attorney and agreed to accept the plea agreement. He admitted to his lawyer that the charges were true. He had been working for Soviet intelligence since 1974. He had compromised classified information. He was guilty of espionage. Carlson conveyed this to the family during a meeting at their home on June 16th. Catherine's reaction was disbelief, followed by anger. "Why would you do this?" she shouted at the attorney. "Why would you convince him to plead guilty if he's innocent?" Carlson explained as gently as possible that David had admitted his guilt, that the evidence was overwhelming, that a plea agreement was the best outcome they could hope for. Catherine refused to accept this. She believed her husband was being coerced or manipulated, but Jennifer, who had always been more pragmatic than her mother, understood what Carlson was saying. She looked at Michael across the living room. "Did you know?" she asked him. "Did you know that Dad was guilty?" Michael met her eyes. "I suspected," he said quietly. "I found some things in my bedroom before he was arrested, things that didn't make sense." "What things?" Catherine demanded. Michael described the metal box, the Minox camera, the one-time pad, the notebook with dates and locations. As he spoke, Catherine's face went through a progression of emotions: denial, realization, horror, and finally, a kind of exhausted acceptance. "You knew," she said to Michael. "You knew and you didn't tell us." "I didn't know what to do," Michael said. "I was trying to protect you." "By keeping secrets?" Jennifer said. Her voice was sharp. "By letting us find out this way?" The conversation disintegrated into accusations and recriminations. Catherine left the room and locked herself in the master bedroom. Jennifer sat on the couch, crying silently. Michael stood in the center of the living room, feeling the weight of his choices settling over him like a shroud. The formal plea hearing was held on July 2, 1982, in the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Virginia. David Brennan, dressed in a suit his wife had brought from home, stood before Judge Harrison Campbell and admitted to one count of conspiracy to commit espionage in violation of Title 18, United States Code, Section 794. The prosecution read into the record a summary of David's activities: the recruitment in 1974, the 8 years of intelligence operations, the dead drop system, the compromised documents, the payments totaling more than $250,000. David confirmed that the summary was accurate. Judge Campbell accepted the guilty plea and scheduled sentencing for September 10, 1982. The sentencing hearing was brief but devastating. The prosecution presented their damage assessment, which concluded that David's activities had resulted in significant harm to national security. Judge Campbell acknowledged the plea agreement, but emphasized the seriousness of the crime. "You betrayed your country, your oath, and your colleagues," Campbell told David. "You compromised operations that put lives at risk. You did this not out of ideological conviction, but for money. The court accepts the government's recommendation of 18 years in federal prison, but I want you to understand that this sentence is lenient given the magnitude of your betrayal." David Brennan showed no emotion during the sentencing. He was led from the courtroom in handcuffs and transferred to the Federal Correctional Institution in Cumberland, Maryland, where he would serve his sentence. He was 51 years old. His earliest possible release date would be in the year 2000, when he would be 69 years old. The years following David Brennan's imprisonment were marked by fragmentation and loss for the family. Catherine remained in the Falls Church House for another 14 months, unwilling to abandon the only home her children had known, but the financial burden of maintaining the property on her library salary alone became unsustainable. The Defense Intelligence Agency had terminated David's employment immediately upon his arrest, which meant the family lost not only his income, but also his government pension and health insurance benefits. The legal fees, though minimal given that David had used a public defender, still exceeded $10,000. The savings account David had maintained was seized by the government as proceeds of illegal activity. The $7,000 in cash from the metal box was also seized. In June 1983, Catherine sold the house for $82,000, significantly less than its assessed value, but she needed to sell quickly. She used part of the proceeds to pay off the remaining mortgage and moved into a small 2-bedroom apartment in Arlington. Jennifer transferred from Bryn Mawr to George Mason University to be closer to home and to reduce tuition costs. Michael completed his degree at Georgetown, graduating in May 1984 with a degree in political science, but his post-graduation plans, which had included applying to law school, were abandoned. The cost of law school was impossible given the family's circumstances, and Michael's recommendation letters were complicated by the fact that his father was a convicted spy. The social consequences were equally devastating. Friends who had been close to the family for years distanced themselves. Some did this explicitly, expressing disapproval or discomfort. Others simply stopped calling, stopped visiting, allowed the relationships to fade through to passive neglect. Catherine lost her position at the library in August 1983, officially due to budget cuts, but unofficially because the library director felt her presence was disruptive and embarrassing given the media coverage of her husband's case. She found part-time work as a cashier at a department store, a job that paid minimum wage and offered no benefits. Jennifer's experience at George Mason was marked by isolation. When classmates learned who her father was, and the news spread quickly through casual conversation and background checks required for student employment. She became known as the spy's daughter. She withdrew from most social activities, focusing exclusively on her coursework, and graduated in May 1986 with a degree in art history. She moved to Boston later that year, putting as much physical distance as possible between herself and the Washington area, where the family name would always be associated with betrayal. Michael's path was more complicated. He worked a series of temporary jobs, administrative assistant positions, data entry, research work for think tanks, but found it difficult to establish a career. Security clearances, which were required for many positions in the Washington area, were impossible for him to obtain given his father's conviction. Every background check surfaced his relationship to David Brennan. Some employers were understanding but ultimately unwilling to take the risk. Others simply rejected his applications without explanation. He visited his father in prison once, in November 1984. The visit lasted 30 minutes and was conducted in a visitation room with a glass partition separating them. They communicated via telephone handsets. David looked older than his 53 years. His hair had gone completely gray. He had lost weight. He asked about Catherine and Jennifer. Michael provided brief updates. Then David asked, "How did they catch me?" Michael hesitated. The question hung between them like an accusation. "Someone reported you," Michael said finally. "Who?" David asked. "I don't know," Michael lied. "Maybe someone at work noticed something. Maybe they were already watching you." David studied his son through the glass partition. "Your mother told me you found the box," he said, "before I was arrested. You found it when we were packing up the house." Michael said nothing. "Did you call the FBI?" David asked. Michael wanted to deny it. He wanted to claim that someone else had made the call, that the investigation had been triggered by some other evidence, by some coincidence that had nothing to do with him, but he could not maintain the lie under his father's direct gaze. "Yes," he said quietly. "I didn't know what else to do." David nodded slowly. He seemed almost relieved to have the question answered. "I understand," he said. "You did what you thought was right." "Did I?" Michael asked. The question came out more sharply than he intended. "I destroyed our family. Mom lost her job. Jennifer had to transfer schools. We lost the house. Everything fell apart because of what I did." "Everything fell apart because of what I did," David corrected him. "You just made sure I was held accountable. If you hadn't reported me, I would have continued. I would have kept betraying the agency, kept taking Soviet money, kept lying to your mother. Eventually, I would have been caught anyway. They always catch spies eventually. But by then, the damage would have been even greater." "Why did you do it?" Michael asked. "Why did you betray your country? Was the money really worth it?" David leaned back in his chair. He was quiet for a long time. "No," he said eventually. "The money wasn't worth it. I started because I was angry and stupid and they manipulated me. I continued because I was afraid of what would happen if I stopped. Every time I made a dead drop, I told myself it would be the last one. But then there would be another coded message, another meeting date, another package to deliver. I was trapped by my own choices." "You could have turned yourself in," Michael said. "I could have," David agreed, "but I didn't. And that's on me, not on you. You did the right thing, Michael. I'm proud of you for having the courage to do what I couldn't." They talked for another 10 minutes about inconsequential things, the weather, books David was reading, the food in the prison cafeteria. When their time was up, David said, "Take care of your mother and sister. They need you more than I do." Michael nodded. He left the prison and drove back to Arlington. He never visited his father again. The years passed with the slow accumulation of small tragedies and adjustments. Catherine never remarried. She worked at the department store until she retired in 1998 at the age of 65. Her relationship with Michael remained strained, complicated by his decision to report David and his inability to tell her about it until after the plea agreement. She understood intellectually that Michael had acted out of principle, but emotionally she could never quite forgive him for the role he had played in dismantling their family. She remained polite and civil during the occasional phone calls and rare visits, but the warmth that had characterized their relationship before 1982 never fully returned. Jennifer moved further into isolation. She worked as a curator's assistant at a small museum in Boston, a position that paid poorly but allowed her to avoid extensive background checks and public attention. She changed her last name legally in 1988, adopting her maternal grandmother's maiden name, Sullivan, to distance herself from the Brennan Association. She maintained minimal contact with Michael and Catherine, sending cards on birthdays and holidays, but rarely calling and almost never visiting. She never married, never had children, and spent most of her adult life alone. Michael eventually found stable employment as a researcher at a small nonprofit organization focused on educational policy, work that did not require a security clearance and involved minimal public interaction. He married in 1991 to a woman named Susan Crawford, a social worker he met through mutual friends. They had 2 daughters, born in 1994 and 1997. Michael never told his wife the full story of how his father was arrested. She knew that his father had been convicted of espionage, but Michael allowed her to believe that the arrest had come about through routine FBI investigation rather than through his own report. The deception was small but persistent, a secret that sat between them in their marriage like a hidden weight. David Brennan served 16 years of his 18-year sentence, receiving credit for good behavior and participation in prison programs. He was released in September 1998, at the age of 67. He had nowhere to go. Catherine, by that point living in a small one-bedroom apartment in Arlington and working part-time at a bookstore to supplement her minimal Social Security income, made it clear that he was not welcome to live with her. Their marriage had never been formally dissolved. Catherine had religious objections to divorce, but their relationship had ended in every meaningful sense. David moved to a halfway house in Baltimore, Maryland, where he was required to check in regularly with his parole officer. He found work washing dishes at a restaurant. He lived in a rented room in a boarding house. He was, in every practical sense, indigent and alone. He attempted to contact Michael several times through letters and phone calls, hoping to establish some form of relationship with his son and granddaughters he had never met. Michael responded to the first letter with a brief note acknowledging his father's release, but declining to arrange a meeting. He did not respond to subsequent letters. He blocked his father's phone number after several awkward calls. In December 2002, David Brennan suffered a stroke while at work. He was found unconscious in the restaurant's kitchen by a co-worker and transported to Johns Hopkins Hospital. The stroke was severe, causing significant brain damage and leaving him partially paralyzed. He was transferred to a nursing care facility after 2 weeks in the hospital. The facility was funded by Medicaid and was, by most accounts, understaffed and poorly maintained. David remained there for 18 months, unable to speak clearly or care for himself, before suffering a second stroke that proved fatal. He died on June 3, 2004, at the age of 73. Michael learned of his father's death from a call from the nursing facility administrator who had obtained his contact information from David's emergency records. Michael did not attend the funeral. Catherine, when informed of David's death, expressed neither grief nor relief, only a kind of weary indifference. "He made his choices," she said. "We all have to live with our choices." Jennifer did not respond to the message Michael left, informing her of their father's death. David Brennan was buried in a municipal cemetery outside Baltimore in an unmarked grave. The cost of the burial was paid by a veterans organization that provided basic funeral services for indigent veterans, despite the fact that David's dishonorable conduct had technically forfeited his right to veterans' benefits. 6 people attended the burial service: Michael, Susan Crawford, the nursing facility chaplain, a representative from the veterans organization, and 2 men Michael did not recognize who stood at a distance and did not approach him afterward. Michael later speculated that they might have been FBI agents maintaining surveillance to see who attended, though he never confirmed this. The question of responsibility in cases like the Brennan families is complicated because it requires assigning blame among individuals who were all, to varying degrees, victims of circumstances and choices made by others. Michael Brennan was 19 years old when he discovered evidence of his father's espionage. He was a teenager trying to navigate an impossible moral dilemma with no guidance and no clear right answer. He chose to report his father because he believed it was his duty as a citizen. That choice destroyed his family, estranged him from his mother and sister, and haunted him for the rest of his life. Was he right to make that choice? The answer depends on whose perspective you adopt. From the perspective of national security, Michael's decision was clearly correct. His report led to the arrest of an active Soviet intelligence asset who had been compromising classified information for 8 years. The FBI's damage assessment concluded that David Brennan's activities had harmed American intelligence operations and potentially endangered the lives of intelligence officers operating in hostile territory. Stopping those activities was, by any objective measure, in the national interest. If Michael had remained silent, his father would have continued his espionage until he was caught through some other means, or until he retired and moved to North Carolina, potentially taking with him information and connections that could have been used for years to come. From the perspective of familial loyalty, Michael's decision was a profound betrayal. His father had raised him, supported him, paid for his education, and loved him in whatever imperfect way David Brennan was capable of loving. Michael repaid that by turning him over to law enforcement, ensuring his imprisonment and the destruction of the family. Catherine Brennan's anger at her son was understandable from this perspective. Michael had chosen the abstract principles of citizenship and national security over the concrete obligations of family and blood. He had, in essence, chosen strangers over his own father. From the perspective of moral philosophy, the case presents a classic conflict between competing ethical frameworks. Utilitarian might argue that Michael's decision was correct because it produced the greatest good for the greatest number. National security protected at the cost of one family's happiness. A virtue ethicist might argue that Michael was correct because he demonstrated the virtue of courage and civic responsibility, acting on principle despite enormous personal cost. A duty-based ethicist might argue that Michael had competing duties, duty to country and duty to family, and that choosing between them was inherently tragic, regardless of which duty he prioritized. But these philosophical frameworks, while intellectually interesting, do little to address the lived reality of the people involved. Michael Brennan did not spend decades wrestling with utilitarian calculations or virtue theory. He spent decades living with guilt, wondering whether he had destroyed his family for no good reason, avoiding his father in prison and during his final years, and maintaining a secret from his wife about his role in his father's arrest. Catherine Brennan did not spend her declining years considering duty-based ethics. She spent them working minimum-wage jobs, living in small apartments, and mourning the loss of the life she thought she was building. Jennifer Brennan did not engage with competing moral frameworks. She changed her name, moved across the country, and lived in deliberate isolation to escape the stigma of being a spy's daughter. The human cost of espionage extends far beyond the individuals who commit it. David Brennan chose to betray his country for money and out of a combination of resentment, manipulation, and fear. That choice had ripple effects that destroyed multiple lives across multiple generations. His wife lost her career, her home, and her sense of identity. His daughter lost her name, her family connections, and years of her life to isolation and shame. His son lost his sense of moral certainty and carried guilt for decisions made when he was barely an adult. His granddaughters never knew their paternal grandfather and grew up with only vague, uncomfortable knowledge that he had been a traitor. The Soviet intelligence system that recruited and ran David Brennan operated on the assumption that individuals are exploitable resources, that their weaknesses, grievances, and fears could be manipulated to serve state interests. The American counterintelligence system that caught and imprisoned David operated on the assumption that betrayal must be punished severely to deter others and protect national security. Both systems were, in their own ways, correct about their assumptions, but both systems also created human wreckage in their operation. The families destroyed, the lives ruined, the relationships severed. These were not anomalies or accidents, but inevitable consequences of how espionage operations function during times of prolonged geopolitical conflict. Michael Brennan was 41 years old when his father died in 2004. He had spent 22 years living with the consequences of a decision he made when he was 19. He had built a career, married, raised children, and created a life that appeared stable and successful from the outside. But he had never fully resolved the questions that haunted him. Did he do the right thing? Should he have confronted his father instead of reporting him? Could the family have survived if he had made a different choice? These questions had no satisfying answers because the situation itself allowed for no good outcomes. Every possible choice involved betrayal of some kind, betrayal of country, betrayal of family, betrayal of self. In 2009, Michael and Susan divorced. The reasons were complex and involved more than just the hidden secrets of his father's case, but those secrets had created a distance in their marriage that Susan eventually found intolerable. "I feel like I never really knew you," she told him during one of their final conversations before the divorce was finalized. "You've been carrying something all these years, and you never trusted me enough to share it." Michael tried to explain that it wasn't about trust, that some burdens were too heavy to share, that he was trying to protect her from his own guilt. But Susan was right. He had never fully trusted her with the truth, and that lack of trust had corroded their relationship over nearly 2 decades. Catherine Brennan died in January 2015 at the age of 82. She had lived alone in her small Arlington apartment for the final decade of her life, supported by Social Security and occasional financial help from Michael. Her relationship with her children remained distant until the end. She saw Michael perhaps twice a year, usually around holidays. She had not seen Jennifer in person since 1994 and had spoken with her by phone only a handful of times in the 21 years before her death. In her final months, suffering from congestive heart failure, Catherine told Michael that she had forgiven him for reporting his father. "You were just a kid," she said. "You did what you thought you had to do. I understand that now." But Michael wasn't sure whether she genuinely believed this or was simply trying to offer him absolution before she died. Jennifer Brennan Sullivan, she had kept the Sullivan surname even after her mother's death, attended Catherine's funeral but did not speak to Michael beyond brief acknowledgments. She had become, by all appearances, a functional but deeply damaged adult. She had never married, never had children, never formed significant long-term relationships. She worked in museum administration, a job that allowed her to maintain professional competence while minimizing personal connections. She lived in a small apartment in Boston with 2 cats and spent most of her time alone. When Michael tried to speak with her after Catherine's funeral, hoping that their mother's death might create an opportunity for reconciliation, Jennifer told him clearly, "I don't blame you for what happened to Dad. I understand you thought you were doing the right thing, but I can't be around you without thinking about everything we lost. It's easier for me if we just don't have contact." Michael accepted this. He had lost his sister just as surely as he had lost his father, and there was no remedy for that loss. The story of the Brennan family is not unique. During the Cold War, dozens of similar cases played out across the United States as Soviet intelligence recruited American citizens to betray their country. Some were motivated by ideology, believing in the superiority of the Soviet system. Others were motivated by money, as David Brennan was. Still others were motivated by blackmail, having been compromised in ways that made them vulnerable to coercion. But regardless of motivation, the pattern was similar. Recruitment, years of secret activity, eventual discovery, arrest, imprisonment, and the destruction of families. What makes the Brennan case particularly poignant is the role Michael played in his father's arrest. Most espionage cases are broken through technical surveillance, defectors providing information, or intelligence officers noticing unusual patterns of behavior. The Brennan case was broken because a 19-year-old son found a metal box hidden in his bedroom and made an agonizing choice to report what he had found. That choice was, in one sense, admirable. It demonstrated integrity and courage. But in another sense, it was tragic because it required Michael to betray his father in order to serve what he believed was a higher principle. The philosophical question at the heart of the case is whether Michael had any alternative that would have been morally superior to the choice he made. Could he have confronted his father and demanded that David turn himself in? Perhaps, but this assumes that David would have agreed, and there is little evidence to suggest he would have. David had been operating as a Soviet asset for 8 years by the time Michael found the box. He had long since made his choices and established his patterns. A confrontation might simply have prompted David to flee or destroy evidence, leaving the espionage to continue unchecked. Could Michael have simply left the box where it was and said nothing, allowing his father to retire and move to North Carolina as planned? This would have preserved the family, but would have required Michael to become complicit in his father's espionage, knowing about it but choosing to remain silent. For someone of Michael's temperament and beliefs, raised during the Cold War, educated in American civic values, believing in the seriousness of Soviet threat, this option was psychologically untenable, even if it might have been emotionally preferable. Could Michael have reported his father but done so in a way that allowed the family to be warned and prepared? Not really. The effectiveness of the investigation depended on David not knowing he was under surveillance. If Michael had told his mother or sister, there was a risk they might inadvertently tip off David, allowing him to destroy evidence or flee. The FBI's standard operating procedure in such cases was to maintain absolute secrecy until arrest, specifically to prevent this outcome. So Michael was left with an impossible choice: betray his father to serve his country, or betray his country to protect his father. He chose the former. Whether that choice was morally correct is a question that reasonable people can disagree about. What is undeniable is that the choice had devastating consequences for everyone involved, and those consequences rippled through decades and across multiple lives. By 2015, when Catherine died, The Cold War had been over for nearly a quarter century. The Soviet Union had collapsed in 1991. The geopolitical conflict that had shaped the Brennan family's tragedy no longer existed in the same form. David's espionage, which had seemed so urgent and dangerous in 1982, had become historical artifact, relevant only to scholars and historians studying that period. The classified documents he had photographed and passed to Soviet handlers had long since been declassified or rendered obsolete by changes in technology and international relations. The intelligence sources he had exposed were either dead, retired, or had long since changed their activities. The urgency that justified his arrest and imprisonment had faded, but the human cost remained. Michael Brennan continued to live in the Washington area, working in educational policy research, maintaining relationships with his daughters from his first marriage, and carrying the weight of choices made when he was 19 years old. He attended his mother's funeral, said goodbye to his sister for what would likely be the last time, and returned to his apartment alone. He thought about his father occasionally. David would have been 83 years old if he had lived, though it was hard to imagine him reaching that age given the circumstances of his final years. He thought about the metal box hidden beneath the floorboards, the moment of discovery that had changed everything. He thought about the phone call to the FBI from a payphone outside a 7-Eleven, the anonymous tip that had set in motion events he could not have fully anticipated. The question that stayed with him, that he returned to again and again during quiet moments, was whether any of it had been worth it. Had his report actually protected American security in any meaningful way? Had it prevented some specific harm that justified the destruction of his family? Or had he simply been a cog in a larger machine, performing his assigned role in a system that ground up individuals and families in the service of abstract geopolitical conflicts? He had no way of knowing. The FBI had never provided feedback about the value of his tip. He had never been contacted by prosecutors or investigators asking for additional information. He had simply made the phone call, provided the information, and then watched as the consequences unfolded. In his darker moments, Michael wondered whether his father had been right to call what he did courageous. Perhaps it had been cowardice instead, an inability to handle the burden of knowledge, an eagerness to transfer responsibility to authorities who would make the difficult decisions for him. Perhaps a truly courageous act would have been to confront his father directly, to force a conversation about choices and consequences, to give David the opportunity to turn himself in and potentially negotiate a better outcome. But Michael had been 19 years old, terrified, and convinced that any delay or hesitation would make things worse. He had acted with the limited judgment and emotional capacity of a teenager faced with an impossible situation. Jennifer Brennan Sullivan died in November 2019 at the age of 56. She had suffered from depression for most of her adult life and had made several suicide attempts over the years. The final attempt, involving an overdose of prescription medications, succeeded. She left no note, no explanation, no message for Michael or anyone else. Her body was discovered by a neighbor who noticed that her mail had been accumulating for several days. Michael learned of her death from a phone call from the Boston Police Department, who had found his contact information in Jennifer's emergency records. The funeral was small, attended by fewer than a dozen people, a few colleagues from the museum where Jennifer had worked, the neighbor who had discovered her body, Michael, and a handful of others who had known her casually. Jennifer had requested cremation in the minimal documentation she had left behind. Her ashes were scattered in Boston Harbor at a location she had specified, though she had never explained why that location held significance for her. Michael stood on a boat in the harbor as the ashes were scattered, gray powder dispersing across dark water under overcast skies. He thought about his sister as she had been before their father's arrest, cheerful, artistic, planning to study art history in graduate school, optimistic about her future. He thought about how that person had been gradually erased over the 37 years following April 1982, replaced by someone withdrawn, isolated, and ultimately unable to sustain the burden of existence. The causal chain from David Brennan's espionage to Jennifer's suicide was long and complicated, involving dozens of intermediate factors and decisions. But Michael could not escape the feeling that his decision to report their father had set in motion the events that led, ultimately, to his sister's death. This was, he recognized, probably irrational. Jennifer's mental health struggles were complex and involved factors beyond family trauma. She had been treated for depression, had been prescribed medications, had seen therapists. Many people experienced family tragedies without ultimately taking their own lives. Michael's therapist, he had been seeing one since his divorce in 2009, had told him repeatedly that he could not hold himself responsible for every consequence that flowed from his decision in 1982. But Michael could not fully internalize this message. He had made a choice that destroyed his family. His mother had died estranged from her children. His sister had died alone after decades of isolation. His father had died in a nursing home after years of imprisonment and poverty, and Michael himself had spent 40 years carrying guilt and doubt about whether any of it had been necessary. The Soviet intelligence officer who recruited David Brennan, identified in declassified documents as Yuri Petrov, though this was likely a cover name, had defected to the United States in 1988 during the final years of the Cold War. He provided extensive debriefings about KGB operations in the United States during the 1970s and 1980s. Among the cases he discussed was that of David Brennan, whom he described as a reliable but unremarkable asset. He provided decent intelligence for several years, Petrov said, according to debriefing transcripts, but nothing critical. We had better sources with higher access. Brennan was useful, but not essential. This assessment, delivered with the cold calculation of a professional intelligence officer, suggested that David's betrayal had not actually been particularly valuable to Soviet intelligence. The classified documents he photographed, the intelligence he provided, the dead drops he serviced, all of it had been absorbed into the massive Soviet intelligence collection apparatus and evaluated as moderately useful but not game-changing. Michael learned about this assessment in 2016 when some of the debriefing materials were declassified and made available to researchers. He read through Petrov's descriptions of recruiting and running David, looking for some indication that his father's espionage had represented a serious threat that justified the devastation of the Brennan family. But what he found instead was a portrait of a small-time asset, someone whose intelligence contributions were valuable enough to keep him active, but not significant enough to change any major strategic assessments. The Soviet intelligence apparatus had exploited David's weaknesses and grievances, squeezed intelligence from him for 8 years, and then moved on to other operations when he was arrested. From their perspective, David Brennan was a resource that had been useful for a time and then was depleted. His personal fate, the destruction of his family, the decades of suffering that followed his arrest. None of this registered in the Soviet assessment as anything other than an operational loss. This realization was, in some ways, the most difficult thing Michael had to confront. If his father's espionage had been truly damaging, if it had compromised critical operations or endangered lives, then perhaps the family's destruction could be understood as a necessary sacrifice for the greater good. But if David's intelligence contributions were merely decent and moderately useful, if the Soviet intelligence apparatus had dozens of other sources providing similar information, then the justification for everything that followed seemed hollow. Michael had destroyed his family to stop espionage that, in the larger scheme of Cold War intelligence operations, had been relatively insignificant. But this conclusion carried its own complications. Even moderately useful intelligence could have real-world consequences. Even a small-time asset could compromise operations that affected real people's lives. The damage assessment prepared by the Defense Intelligence Agency after David's arrest had identified specific intelligence sources that had been exposed based on information David provided. Some of those sources had been recalled from their positions. Others had been arrested by Soviet authorities. The fact that Soviet intelligence had other sources did not mean David's betrayal had been harmless. It simply meant that his betrayal had been one part of a larger system of espionage that operated on both sides of the Cold War throughout its duration. Michael Brennan turned 60 years old in March 2023. He had been retired from his position at the nonprofit educational policy organization for 3 years. He lived alone in a small condo in Silver Spring, Maryland. His relationship with his daughters from his first marriage was cordial but not close. They saw him on holidays and called occasionally, but they had their own lives, their own families, their own concerns. They knew their grandfather had been a spy, knew their father had been involved somehow in his arrest, but they had grown up with this knowledge as background information rather than active trauma. To them, it was simply part of their family history, unfortunate but distant. Michael spent his retirement reading, volunteering at a local literacy program, and trying to come to terms with the choices he had made 41 years earlier. He had written, over the years, several unsent letters to his father, trying to articulate why he had reported him, trying to explain the impossible position he had been in, trying to seek forgiveness or understanding or something that might alleviate the weight he carried. These letters remained in a folder in his desk drawer, unsent because their recipient had been dead for nearly 2 decades. On the evening of April 16, 2023, exactly 41 years after his father's arrest, Michael drove to Rock Creek Park. He walked along the trails until he found the area where his father had serviced dead drops in the early 1980s. The park had changed over the years. Some trails had been paved, new signs had been erected, trees had grown or been removed. But the essential character of the place remained the same: forested, peaceful, removed from the urban intensity of Washington just a few miles away. Michael stood near the approximate location where surveillance agents had observed his father conducting the dead drop that provided the final confirmation needed for his arrest. He tried to imagine what his father had been thinking during those moments. The fear, the calculation, the habitual practice of a tradecraft he had performed dozens of times. He tried to imagine his father's life during those 8 years of espionage, the secret meetings, the coded messages, the photography sessions in his office late at night, the accumulation of money hidden beneath floorboards, the construction of a double life that required constant vigilance and deception. The question Michael kept returning to, the question that had never been satisfactorily answered despite 41 years of reflection, was whether his father had ever genuinely believed in what he was doing. Had David convinced himself that providing intelligence to Soviet handlers was somehow justified, that the American intelligence apparatus was corrupt or wrong, that the Soviet system deserved support, that the information he was providing would not cause real harm? Or had he always known, at some level, that he was betraying his country, his colleagues, and his family for money and out of resentment? Based on David's statements to FBI investigators and during his plea agreement, Michael knew that his father had not been motivated by ideology. David had never expressed sympathy for communism or criticized American democracy. His motivation had been primarily financial, supplemented by professional resentment over the promotion he was denied in 1972. But Michael also knew from his one prison visit and from things his father had said in letters over the years that David had rationalized his activities through various mental accommodations. He had told himself that the intelligence he was providing was not that important, that Soviet handlers probably already knew most of what he was telling them, that he was not really causing any harm. These rationalizations were, of course, false. The intelligence David provided had caused harm. Sources had been exposed, operations had been compromised. The aggregate effect of his 8 years of espionage, while perhaps not critical in the larger scheme of the Cold War, had still damaged American intelligence capabilities and potentially endangered lives. But David had needed to believe these rationalizations in order to continue his activities and maintain his self-image as fundamentally a decent person who was caught in unfortunate circumstances. Michael understood this psychological process because he had engaged in similar rationalizations about his own choices. He had told himself that reporting his father was the right thing to do, that protecting national security was more important than protecting his family, that the consequences, while devastating, were justified by the principle he was upholding. But he had also spent 41 years questioning whether these rationalizations were true or whether they were just the mental accommodations he needed to make to live with the consequences of his decision. The sun was setting as Michael walked back through Rock Creek Park toward the parking lot where he had left his car. The light filtering through the trees was golden and diffuse, creating shadows that stretched across the trails. Other people were in the park, joggers, dog walkers, families with children. To all of them, this was simply a pleasant urban park on a spring evening. None of them knew that decades earlier this location had been the site of espionage operations that had destroyed a family and reverberated through generations. Michael thought about his father, who had been 51 years old when he was arrested and had died at 73, broken and alone. He thought about his mother, who had spent the last 33 years of her life working minimum-wage jobs and living in small apartments, her dreams of retirement and a comfortable life destroyed by her husband's betrayal. He thought about his sister, who had died at 56 after decades of isolation and depression, unable to escape the stigma of being a spy's daughter. He thought about his own life, the career opportunities foreclosed by his family connection to a convicted traitor, the failed marriage, the strained relationships with his daughters, the decades of guilt and uncertainty. And he thought about a 19-year-old version of himself, standing in his childhood bedroom with a metal box in his hands, trying to decide what to do. That young man had been trying his best to navigate an impossible situation with limited information and no guidance. He had made a choice that seemed, at the time, to be the only morally defensible option available to him. Whether that choice had been correct was a question Michael could no longer answer with any confidence. The consequences had been too devastating, the aftermath too complicated, the human cost too high. The question of whether Michael Brennan did the right thing by reporting his father is ultimately unanswerable, because it depends on values and priorities that different people will weight differently. From the perspective of abstract civic duty, he clearly made the correct choice. From the perspective of family loyalty, he clearly made the wrong choice. From the perspective of consequentialism, the answer depends on whether one believes preventing David's continued espionage justified the destruction of the Brennan family. From the perspective of deontological ethics, the answer depends on whether one believes Michael had an absolute duty to report criminal activity regardless of consequences. But these philosophical frameworks, while intellectually rigorous, do not capture the lived reality of Michael Brennan's experience. He did not spend 41 years analyzing ethical theories. He spent 41 years living with doubt, guilt, loss, and the knowledge that a choice he made when he was barely an adult had irrevocably shaped the trajectory of multiple lives. Whether that choice was right or wrong in some abstract moral sense mattered less than the fact that it had to be made, that no good options were available, and that the consequences were irreversible. Michael Brennan was 19 years old when he found evidence that his father was a spy for the Soviet Union. He was 60 years old when he stood in Rock Creek Park, trying to make sense of choices made decades earlier. And in between, he had lived a life shaped by a single moment of discovery and the decision that followed. The weight of that decision never fully lifted, the questions it raised were never fully answered, and the losses it caused were never fully reconciled. This is the human cost of espionage, not just the classified documents compromised or the operations exposed, but the families destroyed, the relationships severed, and the decades spent wondering whether any of it had to be this way.